Long Island, New York, June 13th, 1942, just past midnight. A German U-boat surfaced 300 yards off Amagansett Beach, its hull black against blacker water, engines idling in the fog. 4 men climbed into a rubber raft, paddling toward shore with muffled oars, carrying wooden crates sealed with wax. When the raft scraped sand, the first man to step onto American soil was Georg Dasch, a former waiter from Berlin. He stood in the surf for a long moment, salt water soaking through his shoes, and whispered to the man beside him, "We are here. God help us, we are actually here." 6 months earlier, in a nondescript building outside Berlin, 8 men sat in wooden chairs facing a table where 3 intelligence officers reviewed their files. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and anxiety. Outside, December snow fell on a city that had not yet learned what total war truly meant. The men had been selected carefully. All had lived in America. All spoke fluent English. All had reasons to serve the regime, some ideological, some practical, some simply desperate for purpose in a world that had long since stopped making sense. Georg Dasch was 39, thin and nervous, with the careful posture of someone who had spent years carrying trays in expensive restaurants. He had lived in New York for 19 years, married an American woman, washed dishes, and waited tables in establishments from the Automat to the Waldorf Astoria. When war began, he returned to Germany, found work in a radio factory, and volunteered for intelligence training when recruitment posters appeared in his neighborhood. Ernst Berger sat 3 chairs down, 36 years old, broader and quieter than Dasch. He had been a machinist in Detroit and Chicago, member of a German-American social club, naturalized American citizen. But in 1933, he had made the mistake of visiting relatives in Germany and expressing admiration for the new government. They convinced him to stay. By 1940, he understood his error but found no way to leave. Now he sat in this room, trying not to think about the wife and daughter he had left in Michigan. Richard Quiring, Heinrich Heinck, Herbert Haupt, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel, Edward Curling. 8 names. 8 lives that converged in this moment of cold December assessment. The officer at the center of the table spoke. "You will be trained for sabotage operations in the United States. You will learn explosives, incendiaries, communication protocols. You will memorize targets, aluminum plants, hydroelectric facilities, railroad terminals, locks, and canals. You will be inserted by submarine and operate independently until recalled or captured." No one asked what happened if captured. Everyone knew. They spent 3 months at a sabotage school near Brandenburg, learning to build bombs from materials available in American hardware stores. Powdered aluminum and iron oxide for thermite. Picric acid and sulfuric acid for improvised explosives. Timing devices fashioned from cheap alarm clocks. The instructors were patient and thorough, men who had operated in Spain and Poland and knew that successful sabotage required not courage but meticulous preparation. Dasch proved competent but unenthusiastic. He assembled his practice devices correctly, memorized his cover story, studied maps of New York's power grid. But at night, in the barracks, he wrote long letters to his wife that were never sent. In them, he tried to explain something he barely understood himself, that he felt caught between 2 countries, belonging fully to neither, serving a cause he did not truly believe in, because believing in nothing at all seemed worse. Berger was more direct. One evening he approached Dasch in the latrine, the only place without listening devices. "I don't want to do this," Berger said quietly. "I have family in America. Real family, not regime propaganda." Dasch looked at him for a long moment. Then, carefully, "Neither do I." They said nothing more, but something unspoken passed between them. An understanding. A possibility that neither was yet ready to name. In May, they received their final briefings. They would be divided into two teams. Team 1, Dash, Berger, Heinck, and Quirin, landing on Long Island. Team 2, Curling, Haupt, Neubauer, and Thiel, landing in Florida. Each team carried $60,000 in cash, explosive materials disguised as consumer goods, and detailed lists of targets. Their cover stories were elaborate. Dash would pose as a salesman, Berger a machinist seeking work. The younger men would blend into industrial areas, find jobs in defense plants, gather intelligence while preparing sabotage operations. The night before departure, an officer gave them a final speech about duty and destiny and the Reich's inevitable victory. The men listened with varying degrees of conviction. Dash stared at his hands. Berger closed his eyes. The others nodded at appropriate moments, performing certainty they did not feel. They were issued American clothing, suits from Macy's, shoes from Florsheim, underwear still bearing department store tags. Everything authentic, everything designed to help them disappear into the country they were meant to attack. On June 11, 1942, they boarded U-202 at Lorient, France. The submarine smelled of diesel and sweat, and the ocean pressing against steel. As the hatches sealed and the boat submerged, Dash thought, I am going home. And also, I am about to commit treason against my homeland. Both thoughts were true. The crossing took 9 days. U-202 traveled submerged during daylight, surfaced at night to recharge batteries and run diesel engines. The men stayed in the forward torpedo room, cramped and seasick, playing cards and smoking too much. No one spoke about the mission. No one spoke about much at all. On June 13th, around 11 p.m., the captain announced they had reached the designated landing zone off Long Island. Conditions were poor, heavy fog, rough surf, Coast Guard patrols active. But the operational window was closing. They needed to go now or abort entirely. Dash and his team prepared in silence. Changed into German Marine uniforms, per protocol, so if captured on the beach, they would be treated as prisoners of war rather than spies. Loaded the rubber raft with 4 wooden crates containing explosives, fuses, timing devices, and $70,000 in cash. Sighed awkward goodbyes to the second team, who would land in Florida 4 days later. The U-boat surfaced 300 yards offshore. Waves crashed against the hull. Fog reduced visibility to almost nothing. Perfect conditions for an unobserved landing, or perfect conditions for disaster. They launched the raft at 12:15 a.m. Paddling through the surf, Dash felt time become strange and elastic. Each stroke of the oar seemed to take hours. The distance to shore felt both infinite and terrifyingly short. When the raft finally scraped sand, he sat frozen for several seconds, unable to process that they had actually arrived. Berger touched his shoulder. We need to move. They dragged the raft onto the beach, began unloading crates. The fog pressed close, muffling sound, turning the world into a gray void, punctuated by the rhythm of invisible waves. And then, through the fog, a light. Seaman Second Class John Cullen was 21 years old, armed with a flare gun and profound boredom. He had been walking the Amagansett Beach patrol route for 6 months without incident. Fog patrols were the worst. Cold, wet, impossible to see anything. Hours of walking in circles while trying not to think about how pointless it all seemed. At approximately 12:30 a.m., he saw shapes moving near the waterline. His first thought, fishermen. His second thought, smugglers. His third thought, slower to form, something is very wrong here. He approached cautiously, calling out, "Who's there?" Dash heard the voice and felt his heart stop. For a split second, every possible future collapsed into this moment. Fight, run, surrender, shoot the American, and hide the body and pretend this never happened. Instead, he stepped forward out of the fog and said, in English with only the slightest German accent. "We're fishermen from Southampton. Our boat ran aground." Cullen played his flashlight across them. 4 men in strange clothing, soaking wet, standing next to a rubber raft and wooden crates. Nothing about this scene made sense. "You don't look like fishermen," Cullen said. Dash's mind raced. They were supposed to be wearing civilian clothes, but had not yet changed. The crates were partially open, exposing suspicious contents. The other men stood frozen, waiting for him to solve this impossible situation. He made a decision that would alter everything that followed. Dash stepped closer to Cullen, hands raised, voice calm. "Listen," he said. "We are fishermen, but we're also running some things we'd prefer the Coast Guard didn't know about. You understand?" Cullen did not understand. But he was 21, armed with only a flare gun, facing 4 men who were clearly stronger and possibly dangerous. He nodded slowly. Dash reached into his pocket, pulled out a roll of bills. $260, more money than Cullen made in 6 months. "I'm going to give you this," Dash said carefully, "and you're going to forget you saw us. We'll be gone by morning. Nobody gets hurt. You go back to your patrol and file no report." Cullen stared at the money. Everything in his training said to refuse, to fight, to raise the alarm. Everything in his survival instinct said to take it and walk away. He took the money. Dash leaned close and whispered, "You will remember my face. I will remember yours. If you report this, I will find you." It was a bluff. Dash had no intention of finding anyone, but Cullen didn't know that. He nodded again, stuffed the money in his pocket, and walked quickly back into the fog. When he was gone, Berger exhaled shakily. "That was close." "Too close," Dash replied in German. "We need to move. Now." They buried the crates in the sand above the high tide line, changed into their civilian clothes, and began walking inland. The German Marine uniforms they buried separately, weighted with rocks, evidence they could not afford to carry. By 2 a.m., they reached Amagansett train station. The building was dark. The next train to New York City departed at 6:17 a.m. They had 4 hours to wait, 4 hours to sit in the fog and pretend they belonged there. Dash bought tickets when the station opened. The clerk barely looked at them. 4 men in business suits, unremarkable, forgettable, exactly as planned. On the train to Manhattan, Berger leaned close and whispered, "What are we going to do?" Dash watched Long Island farmland scroll past the window. "I don't know yet," he said, "but we're not blowing up any factories." Cullen walked back to the Coast Guard station in a state of shock. He had $260 in his pocket, and a story he could not quite believe himself. 4 men, a rubber raft, crates full of something, a bribe and a threat. For 20 minutes, he convinced himself to say nothing. The money was real. The threat felt real. Why risk it? But around 3 a.m., lying in his bunk unable to sleep, he understood. Those were not fishermen. That was not smuggling. Something far more serious had just happened on his watch. He woke his commanding officer, Lieutenant Warren Barnes, told the story haltingly, expecting disbelief or anger. Barnes listened without interrupting, then immediately called for a full patrol of the beach. They found the buried crates at dawn, opened them carefully in the gray morning light. Inside, blocks of TNT, incendiary devices, timing mechanisms, German instructions printed on waterproof paper. Barnes contacted his superiors. Within hours, FBI agents arrived from New York. Within a day, the story reached J. Edgar Hoover's desk in Washington. Enemy agents had landed on American soil. They were armed, funded, and already loose in the country's largest city. The manhunt began. Dash and his team checked into the Governor Clinton Hotel on 7th Avenue, using their cover identities. The lobby smelled of floor wax and cigarettes. The desk clerk gave them keys without curiosity. They were 4 more anonymous faces in a city of 8 million. In his room, Dash sat on the bed and stared at the telephone. He had been thinking about this moment since Brandenburg, since before Brandenburg, since he first returned to Germany in 1941 and realized he had made a catastrophic mistake choosing the wrong side. He wanted to call the FBI, wanted to turn himself in, expose the operation, prevent any actual sabotage. But if he called too soon, the second team in Florida might still succeed. If he called too late, he might be captured before making contact. The timing needed to be precise. And he needed Berger's support, needed to know he was not alone in this decision. That evening, they met in Berger's room. The other 2 team members had gone to a movie, leaving them privacy to speak freely. "I'm going to turn us in," Dash said without preamble. Berger nodded slowly. "When?" "Soon. Within days. I need to make sure the Florida team has landed so the FBI can catch them too. They'll think we're spies. They'll put us on trial. We are spies," Dash said. "But we're spies who stopped a sabotage operation. That has to count for something." Berger stood at the window, looking down at 7th Avenue traffic. "I have family in Michigan. A daughter who's 9 years old. If I go to prison, I might never see her again. If we don't do this," Dash replied, "people will get hurt. Maybe your daughter's school. Maybe the factory where she works someday. We can't let that happen." They sat in silence as the sun set behind Manhattan's skyline, casting long shadows across the room. Finally, Berger said, "Okay, we do it." On June 14th, Dash called FBI headquarters in New York, asked to speak to someone about a matter of national security, was transferred 3 times before reaching an agent named Dean McWhorter. "I need to speak with J. Edgar Hoover," Dash said. "Mr. Hoover doesn't take random calls," McWhorter replied, sounding bored. "Tell him," Dash said carefully, "that a German agent just landed on Long Island with explosives and plans to sabotage American infrastructure. Tell him I can provide names, locations, and evidence. Tell him I'm calling from the Governor Clinton Hotel in Manhattan. Silence on the line. Then, stay where you are. Don't leave the hotel. Don't contact anyone. Someone will come to you." The line went dead. Dash sat in his room for 6 hours. No one came. Around 10 p.m., he called again. Got a different agent. Repeated his story. Was told again to wait. Nothing happened. On June 15th, Dash took the train to Washington. If the FBI wouldn't take him seriously in New York, he would go directly to headquarters. He carried with him $82,000 in cash from the mission funds, a desperate gesture to prove his legitimacy. At FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue, he approached the front desk and said, "I need to speak with someone about German sabotage agents operating in the United States. I am one of them, and I want to confess." The receptionist stared at him. "Sir, if this is a joke." "It's not a joke." Dash placed a thick envelope on the desk. "There's $82,000 in there. German money. Meant to fund sabotage operations. I'm turning it in along with myself." Within 10 minutes, he was in an interrogation room facing 2 senior agents. Within an hour, J. Edgar Hoover himself was briefed on the situation. Within 6 hours, a full task force was assembled. Dash told them everything. The training in Brandenburg, the U-boat crossing, the landing at Amagansett, the burial of equipment, the Florida team scheduled to land at Ponte Vedra Beach, names, dates, targets, operational procedures. He spoke for 13 hours straight, barely pausing for water. The agents took notes with expressions of carefully controlled alarm. This was worse than they had imagined, but also better. They had a full confession from someone on the inside. When Dash finally finished talking, exhausted and hoarse, the lead agent asked, "Why did you turn yourself in?" Dash thought about the question, about the long years in New York, when he had been nobody in particular, just another immigrant trying to make a living. About returning to Germany and finding a country he no longer recognized. About crossing the Atlantic with explosives and realizing he could not go through with it. Because, he said finally, I lived in America long enough to understand what it means. Freedom isn't perfect, but it's real. And I couldn't destroy that for a regime I don't believe in anymore. The FBI moved quickly. Within 24 hours, they had arrested Berger, Heinck, and Quirin in New York. Within 48 hours, they had apprehended the entire Florida team at various locations in Jacksonville and Chicago. The Bureau announced the arrests on June 27th, presenting it as a triumph of investigative work. They did not mention Dash's surrender, did not acknowledge that without his confession, the operation might have succeeded. Hoover wanted Americans to believe their law enforcement was competent and omniscient, not that they had gotten lucky. Dash and Berger were held separately from the others, treated as witnesses rather than prisoners. They provided additional intelligence, confirmed details, helped prosecutors build their case. But as weeks passed, both men began to understand the government did not intend to honor any promises of leniency. They would be tried alongside the others, presented to the public as dangerous enemies rather than voluntary defectors. On July 2, 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order establishing a military tribunal to try all 8 men. The trial would be closed to the public. The proceedings would be swift. The outcome was predetermined. The military tribunal convened on July 8th in the Department of Justice building. The 8 men sat in wooden chairs facing a panel of 7 generals. Outside, protesters demanded execution. Inside, lawyers argued procedural points that everyone knew were meaningless. The prosecution's case was simple. These men had entered the United States with intent to commit sabotage. Under the laws of war, they were unlawful combatants subject to military justice. The penalty for such actions was death. The defense argued that no sabotage had actually occurred, that Dash and Berger had voluntarily surrendered, that the others had committed no acts beyond landing on American beaches and possessing equipment. The tribunal listened politely and disregarded everything. Dash took the stand on July 14th. He explained his decision to confess, detailed the intelligence he had provided, emphasized that he had prevented the operation from succeeding. I saved American lives, he said. I prevented industrial sabotage. I betrayed my orders to serve what I believed was right. The prosecution cross-examined him brutally. If he truly opposed the regime, why had he accepted the mission at all? If he planned to confess, why not do so in Germany? If he was loyal to America, why had he returned to Germany in the first place? Dash had no good answers. The truth was complicated, messy, full of contradictions and poor choices and gradual realizations. But military tribunals do not accommodate complexity. The trial lasted 19 days. On August 3rd, the verdict was announced. All 8 men found guilty. All 8 sentenced to death by electrocution. In his cell at the District of Columbia jail, Dash wrote a final letter to President Roosevelt. He did not beg for his life. Instead, he asked a simple question. What is the value of preventing an attack if the person who prevents it is punished as if he had committed it? Roosevelt read the letter, consulted with his advisors, considered the political implications and the moral complexities and the practical realities of wartime justice. On August 8th, he commuted Dash's sentence to 30 years in prison, Berger's to life imprisonment. The other 6 would be executed as scheduled. When Dash received the news, he felt neither relief nor gratitude, just a hollow exhaustion. He had saved American lives and would spend 30 years in prison for it. The 6 men who had trusted him would die. On August 8, 1942, at noon, Edward Curling, Herbert Haupt, Heinrich Heinck, Richard Quirin, Hermann Neubauer, and Werner Thiel were executed by electric chair in the District of Columbia jail. They died within 30 minutes, one after another, their bodies removed and buried in unmarked graves. Dasch and Berger were transferred to federal penitentiaries. They would not see freedom again until 1948, when President Truman granted them clemency on the condition they be deported to Germany and never return. In April 1948, Georg Dasch stepped off a military transport plane in Frankfurt. He had left Germany as a sabotage agent. He returned as a traitor who had betrayed his comrades and served 6 years in an American prison for his trouble. The country he found was unrecognizable. Cities destroyed, infrastructure shattered, millions dead or displaced. The regime that had sent him on his mission had collapsed into ruins, its leaders facing justice or dead by their own hands. Dasch found work in a textile factory, lived in a small apartment, spoke to almost no one about his past. When people asked where he had been during the war, he said simply, America. In 1949, he received a letter from Ernst Berger, who had also been deported to Germany. Berger had found his daughter, now 17, living with relatives in the Soviet zone. They were trying to arrange a reunion, but bureaucracy and borders made everything complicated. The two men never saw each other again. But they maintained sporadic correspondence for years, letters that carefully avoided discussing the mission or the trial or the 6 men who had died. Instead, they wrote about weather and work and the strange experience of being alive when so many were not. The story of Operation Pastorius remained classified for years. When the details finally became public in the 1950s, historians debated what it meant. Some saw it as proof that German intelligence operations were sophisticated and dangerous. Others saw it as evidence that even the best-planned sabotage could fail when individual conscience intervened. Still others viewed it as a cautionary tale about the complexities of loyalty and the impossible positions war creates. For Dasch, the historical interpretations mattered less than the simple fact of survival. He had made choices that seemed right at the time, had suffered consequences that seemed disproportionate, and had lived long enough to see the world change in ways that made the entire operation seem like ancient history. He died in 1992, at 90 years old, in a nursing home in Ludwigshafen. His obituary mentioned his wartime activities briefly, without judgment or elaboration. Just another life touched by the war, marked by decisions made under pressure, remembered imperfectly by a world that had moved on. The real question Operation Pastorius raises is not whether the men were heroes or traitors, patriots or cowards. The real question is simpler and more difficult. What do you do when you find yourself on the wrong side? Dasch and Berger answered by turning themselves in, accepting prison as the price of preventing violence. The other 6 answered by continuing forward, hoping loyalty would be rewarded, discovering too late that wars consume the loyal and disloyal alike. In the end, no factories were destroyed, no trains derailed, no power plants exploded. The operation failed completely, not because of FBI brilliance, but because 2 men decided that orders given in Berlin did not justify actions taken in America. Their reward was prison and deportation, and the rest of their lives spent explaining decisions that made sense in moments of crisis, but seemed incomprehensible in retrospect. Today, Amagansett Beach looks much as it did in 1942. Long stretches of sand, Atlantic waves rolling in with ancient rhythm. Summer homes and restaurants where there were once empty dunes. There is no marker commemorating the landing. No plaque explaining what happened that foggy midnight in June. The beach keeps its secrets, covered and uncovered by tides that care nothing for human history. But sometimes, walking along the shore in early morning fog, you can almost imagine it. 4 men in a rubber raft, wooden crates dragged across sand, a young Coast Guard seaman appearing out of the mist. A decision made in seconds that would echo for decades. And the first words spoken on American soil, "We are here. God help us, we are actually here." Words that captured everything. The fear and determination. The knowledge that crossing an ocean was the easy part. That the real test would come in choosing, moment by moment, what kind of person to be when all the old certainties had dissolved into fog and uncertainty. Dash chose to betray his mission to serve his conscience. It cost him 6 years of freedom and the rest of his life living as a man trusted by neither side. Whether that was heroism or cowardice or simply survival depends on perspective and the judgments we make from the safe distance of history. But standing on that beach, waves washing over the sand where buried crates once lay hidden, it is possible to imagine making the same choice. To understand that sometimes the bravest thing is not to complete the mission, but to abandon it. To recognize that loyalty to abstract causes must sometimes yield to loyalty to human life. The fog rolls in. The waves continue their ancient rhythm. And the beach keeps its secrets, waiting for the next person desperate enough, or brave enough, or foolish enough to choose conscience over orders and live with the consequences.